love exploring color, but across all of my palettes, there are a few colors that you won't see. One of them is the ever bright, aggressively vivid, springy bright green. When it comes to convenience colors, it can be difficult to broadly describe what color it is that we're talking about since each brand has different names and pigments in their formulas. In this video, we are looking at bright greens that are usually made with a phthalo green, either PG7 or PG36, and a bright mixing yellow, often PY3, but not always. We won't be looking at other convenience greens like sap greens and olive greens, or one of my favorite mixers, PY129. I'm also not considering shades like Daniel Smith's Green Gold as part of this study. That is a convenience color made from PG36 and PY3, but it has the addition of a PY50 in it. The nickel azo yellow really brings in some earthiness to the party, which we all know is inside my comfort zone. These bright green hues have been all but eradicated from my paint collection, which made finding a suitable version for this video actually a little bit tricky. I had one pan in a Paul Rubens set, a slightly less bright green in my Etchr palette, and my one and only tube in the Mission Hybrid watercolor gouache set that I have. Like Mission Gold's watercolor version, this yellow-green is made from PY3 and PY36. Not being a huge fan of this color, I took to Instagram to ask why people love it so much. Aside from a few general responses, most people seem to use it for foliage and botanical paintings, which makes sense and is probably why I have never felt the need to include it in my own palette. There were a couple people that mentioned using it as a mixer in portraits, and some very, very specific cases that weren't quite what I was wanting to explore today. So what do I want to do today? I want to see if I can personally find use for and enjoyment out of this assertive color within my own painting preferences for wildlife. Since I am so unpracticed with this color, I started off by exploring the range I will have with it as a mixer. I thought it would be best to use my main studio palette full of colors that I know I already love and enjoy. If you want to learn more about this larger palette, you can check out the video series where I go over each of the colors. I've added a couple colors since those videos, but most of them are included. At this point, while I was filming, I still wasn't sure which of the three greens that I mentioned earlier that I would be using, so I did this swatching process with both the Paul Rubens and the Mission Hybrid paints. I left out the Etchr paint because it was a little bit of a deeper green and more natural looking, so that wouldn't be as big of a challenge for me to use in this video. Likewise, after swatching these two brands, I decided that the Paul Rubens leaned a little more yellow and therefore was a bit closer to the PY129 hues that I am comfortable using. So that left us with Mission Hybrid Yellow-Green as the best choice for me for the study. At the start of this mixing segment, I was showing more of the process so that you can tell what I'm doing. This is not an exact science of ratios. I am just playing around with the colors that might be useful or inspirational when choosing what to paint. Some parts of the swatches have more of the yellow-green color, while others will have more of the other mixing color in the pairing. I also added some water to each swatch so that I could see more variegation within each wash. Though I'm only showing the video footage for the Mission Hybrid Yellow-Green, you can find scans for both this and the Paul Rubens mixes on my Patreon companion post. As a mixing color, this bright green definitely exceeded my expectations. Compared to a PY29, the mixes between the yellow-green and the warmer colors like oranges, reds, and pinks lean closer to brown than to orange. Understandably and expectedly, given there is more green to neutralize those red hues. Despite how different yellow-green and PY129 look on their own, the mixes with the blues and greens are pretty similar. In these pairings, this yellow-green will mix brighter and more saturated hues, while the PY129 will mix earthier versions. When mixed with earth tones, the yellow-green will give you greener leaning and more vibrant olive-green mixes, while the PY129 would produce golden leaning earthy olives. Finally, mixing yellow-green with a neutral like Denise's gray or stormy blue gives a cozy range of sap and deep greens. So there are actually plenty of animals to choose from that would have this bright yellow-green coloration, so it wasn't difficult to find subjects that I could utilize for this color on its own. However, I didn't want this spread to be limited to only using the color straight from the tube. After all, we just did all those mixing studies, so let's put them to good use. To unify the entire sketchbook spread, I started off with a wash that was primarily yellow-green. For each of the 5 animals, I adjusted that wash slightly with another color, such as using yellow for the parrot, the leaf above the frog and the snake, and a softer blue for the Luna moth. I could have done a better job preserving areas that really shouldn't have any green in them, but I did leave the beak of the parrot, the underside of the frog, and the head of the Turaco without a first wash to retain the light white values of the paper. At times, I also used some dry Swedish dishcloth, that is very hard to say, all in a row, to lift areas that needed to be lighter, like the shine of the leaves, the top of the snake, and the body of the moth. When it comes to animals that naturally have this bright green coloration, I usually already have a phthalo blue, turquoise, or green on my palette, as well as a bright yellow to work with. So I just mix my own version of the bright green rather than having a well dedicated to it. I think most of you know that I am not at all against using convenience colors, but which convenience colors a painter will find valuable depends entirely on their subject matter and their personal preferences. To give another niche example, many people don't feel the need to have a gray on their palette. However, I use a soft granulating gray mixed from cerulean blue and Indian red so often that I worked with Da Vinci Paint Co. to make a pre-made version of this color that I keep on most of my working palettes these days. It's a shortcut that prevents me from wearing down my cerulean blue pan since it has a weaker tinting strength than the Indian red. It saves me time on mixing, and I know that I will get a lot of use out of it. However, that color probably isn't as useful to someone who almost always paints bright chromatic floral paintings. I wanted to include this other example so those of you who love bright greens understand that I am not at all trying to say that this color is never worth having on your palette. I personally would just have to use it a heck of a lot more to make room for it on my palette, as I mentioned before, which is why we're here today. Let's find out if this is a color that I have been overlooking. This first little vignette is a male rose-ringed parakeet. They are native to sub-Saharan Africa north of the equator and India. They are one of the few parrot species to adapt to deforested and urbanized habitats, and despite their popularity as pets, their wild populations are still considered stable, if not problematic in some regions. Like humans tend to do, they done effed up when it comes to this species. Due to people releasing their pet parrots into the wild, there are actually established populations of these birds throughout the world. This parakeet's natural adaptability, paired with few natural predators and abundant food sources in urbanized areas, have led to invasive populations across Europe, South Africa, the Middle East, Australia, Japan, and the United States, where they outcompete native wildlife for resources. But they are really, really cute, and it's not their fault that humans, time and time again, introduce invasive species throughout the world. For this little painting, I have been using the bright yellow-green in most of my mixes, except for the solid red on the beak. That was painted with Pyrrole Scarlet. The Perylene Green and Payne's Gray for the darker values, and the same red as the beak for the brown of the bark of the tree. I've been in another flat brush phase lately, so I'm using the silver white brushes in a shape called Bright in a few different sizes. I also don't think I've mentioned yet that I'm working in an A5 Etchr Perfect sketchbook, which has 100% cotton watercolor paper. Before we start talking about the next little vignette, I wanted to let you know about a couple of updates. First up, Happy Pride. There will absolutely be a new Pride video before the end of the month. I actually have 2 additions to the Pride collection this year instead of my usual one, and I'm looking forward to sharing those all with you soon. Next up, this month's Patreon print and sticker are the Battleore Eagles that you might have seen in the final spread of my last sketchbook tour. I love these guys so much, and I hope you do too. Finally, I promise that I didn't forget about or abandon the limited palette series that we just started here on the channel this spring. If you're on Patreon or Instagram, you might have already seen that I lost my Sweet Girl Cricut last month. I've had a really hard time bouncing back, so I'm a bit behind schedule. It's my goal, though, to have the next video to you by the end of the month so that we can get back to exploring more fun palettes. And thank you all, in the meantime, for your understanding. Now back to our painting. I'm not an amphibian expert and Google couldn't help me out, so I'm not sure what species this little guy is, but the reference photo is the first result when you search for either frog leaf or leaf frog on Pixabay. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to highlight different mixes throughout this video, but I also wanted to make sure that I featured the pure yellow-green on its own somewhere on the page. The leaf acting as this frog's umbrella is certainly that. For the leg, I mixed the yellow-green with scarlet red, which is the same combination that I used in the last painting for the Parakeet's tree. Even though we are playing with different mixes, this is meant to be a cohesive spread, so I didn't want to introduce a different shade of red if I didn't have to. And we'll see more of it pop up in the future. On the belly, I used a very diluted version of this red mixture for most of the shadows, and when needed, I could also add a little bit more of the green color to neutralize it further to gray. For the darker greens, I mixed the yellow-green and the perylene green to achieve some nice, rich values. While I don't enjoy painting foliage, I knew that I had to include it somewhere in this spread. These large leaves were perfect for meeting myself halfway since there's no repetition involved, like that found in smaller leafed foliage. I'm continuing to use the flat brushes to carve in some good chunky shapes. When needed to be more detailed, I can turn the brush on its end for smaller mark making. I think this is an arboreal rat snake, but I'm going on my best approximation after doing a few minutes of Google searching. The original stock photo doesn't have an ID, and there are a lot of green tree snakes out there, but I'm pretty sure the arboreal rat snake is correct. Speaking of repetition, like the foliage I was talking about before, I don't know what possessed me to choose this reference photo. It includes both the smaller leaves that I was talking about, as well as a lot of scales that require a lot more attention than I'm usually willing to give a painting, especially one in a sketchbook. However, it's hard for me to feature this color without thinking of various verdant snakes that live in the understories and canopies of rainforests. The snake itself got an extra layer of yellow-green mixed with a bit more yellow, probably PY 154. This was also used on the smaller leaves, indicating the newer growth on the plant. The next set of leaves added a light granulating blue, either cobalt teal or cerulean, plus a bit of perylene green to reach a mid value and also to bring down the saturation a bit. Then I finally went in with the darkest values to anchor the painting, using mostly perylene green with just a touch of the yellow-green to liven it up a bit. When I'm loosely painting a reptile and I want to suggest scales without actually painting at them individually, my favorite brush to do that with is an old beat-up Cotman round brush. It has almost no tip to it, which is vastly different from my favored round brushes like Silver Black Velvets. The sharp points on most round brushes make painting quick oval scales rather challenging because the edges want to be pointed. So I keep this brush around just for this purpose. I place a bunch of marks on the page in varying sizes and then do that again with a mostly clean brush of water to soften off all the edges. Is it fully accurate? Definitely not, but it's fun and keeps the frustration at bay. Once that layer is dry, I switch back to my smaller flat brush to work on the face and bring in some more of those angular marks so that the snake vignette ties in with the others on the page, meaning it's not the only one that has these oval rounded shapes. If you would like a more detailed demonstration on how to properly paint scales, I do have a class on animal textures called Fur, Feathers, and Scales that I will link in the description below. Turacos are probably my favorite green birds to paint, so I knew I had to include one in this spread. The one I'm painting here is a red-crested Turaco, which are endemic to western Angola, but there are many species, around 2/3 of which I believe are green in color. I've always thought Turacos have really fun shapes to paint. What I didn't realize until I was researching for this video is that go-away birds in Africa are also part of the Turaco family. This has nothing to do with the current painting, and they're not even green, but when I visited South Africa and Botswana, I took an immediate liking to them, so I guess I really do have a type when it comes to bird shapes. Anywho, I chose the red crested Turaco for this spread specifically to tie in some of the red from earlier on the left page. I switched back to my larger 1/2-inch flat brush for the body of the bird, which helped me to create some broader strokes and a more cohesive form than I would have been able to achieve with a smaller brush. This was the fastest painting in the spread, and it was a much welcomed change after all those little details of the snake. In the reference, the wing is a very vivid iridescent green. For this study, I decided to pull in more of that cobalt teal to unify it with the blues used earlier on the parakeet. However, when I added perylene green to deepen the values around the curvature of the wing, that darker color did eat up most of those lighter blues. I kept things simple with the face, adding some diluted gray palette mud to knock back the white of the paper, and then I switched to smaller brushes for the eyes. Finally, we have a Luna Moth to cap off the spread and show a softer side of yellow-green. I don't know a lot about most arthropods, and again, I learned something new when I went to ID this reference image. Luna or moon moths can be found across Russia, India, Asia, and North America, but there are many different species. They all share the long tails on their hind wings, but they can range anywhere from the light blue-green that has become popular in artwork over the past decade or so, all the way to yellow or even burnt orange. My best guess without doing a seriously deep dive is that this is an Indian moon moth based on the distinct detached moons on the wings and the light purple at the base of the tail. However, if you're an entomologist or moth nerd and know more about these species than I do, let us know in the comments. On the second layer of paint, I used a mixture of cobalt teal and yellow-green to paint inside the veins of the wings, leaving the light lines between each segment. As I mentioned, this reference has a touch of purple at the base of the tail before transitioning into a more yellowy green. I used the color Lilac from Da Vinci for the purple in the tail, the moons, and later across the upper edge of the wings. For the white-gray body, I used more palette mud, similarly to the face of the Turaco, and across the tops of the wings and in the top halves of the moons, I used Payne's Gray for a cooler, bluer black than the perylene green would have provided. Now that all of our subjects are painted, it's time to tie everything together with a cohesive background. Starting around the parakeet, I used more of the cobalt teal to balance out the cooler, lighter blue-greens on the Luna Moth on the opposite side of the spread. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do for the frog, but the original reference had rain in it. I used cerulean blue and the flat edge of my 1/2-inch flat brush to suggest rain coming down at an angle. I then didn't like how defined it was, so I softened this off a lot with water, leaving only hints of the texture in the final wash. There was a lot of vibrant green right in the middle of the spread. To help tone things down, provide contrast, and to create a transition between the shadows of the leaves underneath the snake to the back of the Turaco, I added a heavy wash of Payne's Gray. I knew I wanted a dark background to set the Luna Moth apart from it, but I didn't want it to be as dark as the center of the spread, so I opted for a wash of perylene green that had just a hint of blue in it. The last step was to add some final details, but to be honest, I wasn't sure how I wanted to do this. I used white gel pen in some areas for strong highlights, but I also knew that I wanted to use some color pencils in other areas, like for the feathers on both birds. So, what do you think? Did I do this color justice? And it's time for me to answer the question, did I enjoy using this bright green? Okay, look, I don't hate it. It's really not that much different from using a PY 129 when it comes to color mixing. I still find the color on its own to be pretty garish, but I do feel more comfortable using it now after this study. I don't think I'll feel the need to add it back into any of my palettes, but perhaps if I were to receive a curated set that includes it, my first instinct wouldn't be to pry it out of the set. That's progress, so I will consider this exercise a success. This isn't going to become a series because there aren't that many colors that I really dislike using, but there is one other. A, do you know what color that is? And B, would you be interested in seeing me tackle it in a future video? Let me know. Before we wrap up, I wanted to remind everyone that World Watercolor Month is around the corner. For anyone new to watercolors, every July the community celebrates the hobby and spreads awareness for the importance of art around the world. Each year there is an official prompt list if you'd like to participate in a daily challenge. However, the challenge is not a requirement of the celebration. Anytime you post a watercolor piece to social media during July, make sure you use the hashtag World Watercolor Month and World Watercolor Month 2024 to connect with others in the community. There is also an official World Watercolor Month shop that artist ambassadors, including myself, donate their artwork to for zipper bags and mugs to be sold throughout the month. 100% of the profits from these sales are donated to the International Child Art Foundation. This video is not sponsored in any way. I have been an artist ambassador for World Watercolor Month since 2018, and I continue to do so every year to help raise funds for this organization that fosters creativity in young people around the world. I hope if you can that you'll take a look. Of course, I also want to thank my patrons for their support. As you all know, it means the world to me that I'm able to keep doing this because of you. If you'd like to join us on Patreon, general support starts at $3 a month. A library of over 100 tutorials and ongoing monthly live streams are available for $8, and the physical rewards for monthly exclusive artwork on stickers and prints begins at $14. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, happy painting!